We can do it. Yes, we can. We can change things throughout the land. But we all must lend a hand. We can do it. Oh, yes, we can. Oh, your neighbor over there, a bit bewildered, but he cares.
Welcome to Changing Our World, North Shore Citizens in Action. We usually have guests who have done something extraordinary and gone abroad and made an impact on a global level. But we're coming back home today to talk about the way that people around the planet interact with us here in the United States. And we have a guest. Her name is Alexandra Pineros-Shields. She is an immigrant. She came here at age 5. I am the daughter of an immigrant. My father came here at age 6 months from Russia. And most of us, except for a few Puritans, if we look back, we too are immigrants. But when our parents, or when we came over, things were very different than they are now, and most people don't realize the changes that have taken place in immigration policy. And I'll have to say the hypocrisy that surrounds our understanding of how welcoming we are to immigrants. So welcome, Alexandra.
Thank you very much.
Tell us a little bit about your background.
Professionally, I have been teaching at Wentworth Institute of Technology, Brandeis University, and Providence College. My area of specialty is immigration policy. I hold a PhD in social policy from the Heller School at Brandeis University. And I've also worked in the field of legal immigration services, nonprofit services, worked at Catholic Charities immigration offices in Boston. And most recently, I was director of programs for almost 2 years at the Irish Immigration Center in Boston, which does legal services, social services, as counseling, as well as English language courses for non-Irish.
Right. You went abroad and you taught English as a second language in China and in Russia.
And in the Soviet Union, yes.
So you've been a foreigner in a strange land as well. So you have a little understanding, I guess. You didn't speak Chinese or Russian, right?
I could manage bartering at the markets in St. Petersburg, but that's about it. I had no Chinese. But your point is a really good one, that I know what it's like to be a foreign worker abroad,
right? All right.
Not just a tourist, but a worker.
Right.
To be part of a working class in a foreign country. And it's really been helpful for me when I teach students. And it gives me a comparison for how we're treating our foreign workers and how I was treated in other countries as a foreign worker.
So let's talk about the first thing one thinks of when you come to immigration. Our Statue of Liberty, give me your hungry, your poor, those yearning to be free. Mm-hmm. That's what we're raised to believe, right? Howard Zinn has written a history of the United States that questions most of what we've ever been taught of American history. But what's wrong with that picture?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, we'll miss Howard greatly. Very similar to his exploration and the way he looks at history from the people's perspective. Our children are often taught in all our schools about this image of the United States as a welcoming country. And in fact, we have been in many ways welcoming, but there's an underside to that story that is quite troubling, in fact. And if people want to read a little bit more about it, there's a great book by a law professor at Boston College Law School, Daniel Canstrom, and it's called Deportation Nation. And it shows that we have actually been quite unwelcoming in many ways. One example that comes to mind immediately is during World War II, at that time our immigration system was based on quotas. So each country in the world, well, not all of them, but the ones we gave quotas to, or the ones we allowed people to come from, had quotas. And so Germany, for example, had a certain amount of, I believe it was about 30,000. Well, we, during World War II, never filled that quota. And there were many Jews fleeing persecution with could not have had a greater, more legitimate claim to being afraid of persecution, and yet we did not fill those quotas. We could have taken each year that many fleeing Jews, and we actually turned boats back of Jews to their death. So it's one example of being unwelcoming. Another example that has had, that continues to have repercussions in our legal code was the Chinese Exclusion Act. In 1863, Congress passed a law saying no more Chinese, and it was
we had gotten them here. They built our railroads, right?
Yes, and it was an economic reason. They were very entrepreneurial and were in competition with our labor force, and so we said no more Chinese. The ones who were here could stay. Well, clearly it was a violation of our Constitution because it was discrimination on the basis of national origin. And so, as expected, this case, a challenge to this law, went all the way to the Supreme Court. And surprisingly or shockingly, the Supreme Court upheld it and said, yes, we acknowledge that it is a violation of our Constitution. However, we're going to use this notion of this doctrine, legal doctrine called the plenary power doctrine. And I hope I don't bore you, but it's kind of an obscure legal doctrine, right? And it says that in the area of who we keep out and who we let in, right? In the area of immigration, as far as who we let in and who we keep out, the Congress, both the legislative and the executive branches can create and implement laws that violate constitutional protections. That's the first point. The second point is that these laws that violate constitutional protections will not be subject to judicial review, that there will be no judicial scrutiny. So it prohibits the courts from stating that they're challenging them or labeling them unconstitutional. And when I teach about this in my classes, I say, one of the things that children are raised to learn, and I think very importantly, is that the structure of our government is beautiful, and it's one of the most beautiful structures because of this idea of the checks and balances of the three branches of government and how there's balancing, that the branches can balance and check each other. Well, and we are also taught to believe that this is a principle that goes across the board, that there's always checks and balances. But in this case, there is no checks and balances. And so it gives the executive and legislative branches extraordinary powers to abuse if they choose to, such in the Chinese Exclusion Act.
I was reading somewhere that impunity is the precursor to just horrific things. Because almost any human being, no matter how good you think you are, if you can get away with something, just look at our tax returns. It may not be right, you may not think it's moral, but if you can get away with it and it's sort of semi-legal, everybody does it. So the same thing is true here. There are always violations then of people's rights if you can get away with it. And it may be an obscure rule, but aren't they using it now? Like we're allowed to assassinate our own citizens abroad and the terrorists can be arrested without habeas corpus. Aren't those all part of the same thing, that our Constitution is being set aside because of extraordinary circumstances?
I really like the examples that you're giving. One of the things, this very semester I was teaching political science at Wentworth, and one of the things, and it was an introduction to political science, and we were talking about this idea of checks and balances, and one of the things I asked them to say, I said, if you remember nothing else about this course, remember that the executive branch's power over the last 50 years, 40 years, has really gained extraordinary power, and that now our system is quite unbalanced.
Especially, Cheney had this idea of the Imperial Presidency, and Obama has not rejected many of the perks.
No, not at all.
And that's sort of like royalty, right? When you think of a king, it's a country where executive power rules. We don't often put it in those terms.
Law journals, especially Georgetown Law School Law Journal, there's quite a lot of writing on plenary power doctrine and how it is active today in terms of immigration. I think one of the ways that we can highlight, which I think was the second part of your question, is what's happening to the undocumented immigrants in the United States. So this is a really key point, is that being undocumented is not a crime. So I'll repeat that. It's not a crime. It's not part of our criminal code. It's not part of our civil code. And I know when I tell people this, they're shocked. What do you mean it's not a crime?
And Congress hasn't made a law that it's criminal?
No, it's not a crime. It's what is called an administrative violation.
Name me another administrative violation, like driving without a driver's license?
Well, that's the example I always used to give. And then, I work at the Irish Immigration Center with lawyers with Greater Boston Legal Services. And so the immigration lawyers corrected me. And this is, and it's, as usual, very, very subtle with lawyers, but very important difference is that it's a hard question to answer. Most administrative violations are local level violations.
Oh.
There's very few administrative violations. There's very few administrative regulations that are federal level.
Oh.
But immigration law is federal, and so it's really hard for that reason to find a federal level equivalent and not a local level equivalent. And number two, sometimes driving violations lead to imprisonment, and an administrative violation never leads to imprisonment.
Okay.
So, and that was the answer that the lawyers gave me. So one of the lawyers came up with there's a set of federal laws around zoning and fences, and how high your fence can be, and that would be the equivalent, because that would never lead to imprisonment. But the fact is that it does lead to imprisonment, so I was confused. And they said, well, this is what's so troubling, is that administrative violations should never lead to imprisonment. And in fact, this is the only example in the United States of an administrative violation that leads to imprisonment, because the people haven't committed a crime. And not only does it lead to imprisonment, it leads to many months of imprisonment.
Well, let's go back, though, to the history of immigration law. When we first started, how did people get into this country?
Yes. Well, in 1924, the U.S. government, the executive branch, decided to create a Bureau of Immigration Affairs. Now, it's pretty shocking that it's that late, right? Because we had massive immigration in the late 1800s.
When my grandparents came.
Yeah. And so, but at that time, prior to 1924, migration was, policies were local level. Each port of entry, New York, San Francisco, had their own kind of rules and regulations. There was some overlap. For example, if you had tuberculosis, or some infectious disease, you were turned away. But in any case, you were just kind of let in, unless for some reason they didn't like you.
Yeah.
We just hosted the President of Ireland at the Irish Immigration Center a year and a half ago for the 20th anniversary of the Irish Immigration Center, Mary McAleese. She gave this absolutely extraordinary speech on immigration, but she talked about her great-grandfather and her grandfather. The two brothers, they came, and one was let in and one was denied entry. And no one knows exactly why, but he was sent back. And so he came back through Canada and lived his whole life as an undocumented immigrant because he wasn't let in through the port of entry. But in any case, back to your question. In 1924, the executive branch decides to create a Bureau of Immigration Affairs. And as the government does, it puts it into a department. And in this case, it chose the Department of Labor, because the thinking was that immigrants are here to work. They come to work, and so they're workers. And the Department of Labor is the right government office to
let workers
deal.
in.
Yeah. In 1940, it was moved to the Department of Justice. World War II is going on. There's fear of the foreigner. There's the Chinese detention camps, the internment camps. Germans are being vilified. And so the immigrants are, the idea that the government has of immigrants is shifting to criminals, and the Department of Justice is charged with dealing with criminals. So the Office of Immigration Affairs is moved to the Department of Justice. When I entered, I had a green card that said Department of Justice as a 5-year-old.
Right. So they're trying to weed out the criminals by viewing everyone as a criminal, and then if you prove you're innocent, you get in, and then...
Yes. It's moved most recently in 2003 to the Department of Homeland Security.
Which is dealing with terrorists.
Exactly. And so you have this progression of immigrants as workers in 1924, immigrants as criminals in 1940, to now immigrants as terrorists. And everybody's processed through the Department of Homeland Security.
Is it the Department of Homeland Security that has set up ICE?
Yes,
Or-
Immigration and Customs Enforcement.
And what do the ICE people do?
Well, they are in charge with immigration enforcement. So basically now, like the services, so when you apply for a green card or asylum is one section and ICE is another. It used to be that they were together. And ICE is like immigration police, basically. But it's more like a secret police because their operations are really covert. The violations of human rights that are happening every day in the United States are extremely troubling.
Now, if this were an American group of police and they were doing this to Americans, we would say we were in Nazi Germany, correct? Because they come in the night, they don't tell anyone about it, and then they sweep people up. Some of you may have seen that from New Bedford. The raid there, they swept into that factory, they grabbed the people, they vanished them to some kind of camp out in the other side of the country, and prior to deporting them, right?
Exactly.
Okay, what's wrong with that?
You know, I just read an article in the Jewish Journal by the Gideon Arnoff. He's the director of the International Agency for Migration of the American Jewish Community. And he was commenting, so it's May 13th if you're interested in looking at it. He was commenting on the laws in Arizona, and he started talking about having papers and always having to carry your papers. And he likened it to Nazi Germany as well. And, you know, he has the authority to say such a thing. One of the problems with ICE is that these families that they're, you know, overwhelming in the middle of the night and violating their private property and privacy are families that are mixed status families. Over 85% of immigrant families are mixed status families. That means that one person's a citizen, another, or a few people can be citizens. Some people have green cards, others have some temporary visa, and some may be undocumented.
Like a cousin showed up at the door, right?
know,
Who sneaked in.
Or within a nuclear family, because the babies might be citizens.
Oh, I see.
A parent might, sometimes husband, so I'm talking about a nuclear family
Right.
will have different statuses.
Right.
And so when they're ripping people out of those homes, they're destroying families. And you know, we talk a lot about family values, and our immigration laws are extremely anti-family, and they're ripping families apart. And that's kind of often in immigrant protests, you'll see allusions to that, and it's a very real.
I understand when they took the families from New Bedford, some of the women who were working, who were moved, thrown into planes, had nursing babies. And they told them, right? They said, I got to get home to my infant. And what happened?
Yeah, that was one of the most egregious, and there's examples in Iowa and in other places. The women actually, in this case, they were taken to Fort Devens and then put on a plane, and while they were on a plane, they were still trying to convince the officers that they had infant children that they cared for and who they had to nourish. And the officers actually forced the women to squeeze milk out of their breasts while everybody watched, to prove, these are male officers,
Right.
to prove to them that they were nursing mothers. And some of the men laughed, saying, let's bring out the Oreos. What do you do with cows? They're milking the cows. Someone get the Oreos. They're milking the cows.
Didn't even send them all back. We had to have people in Boston who were horrified at these infants left, some with babysitters.
8-month baby being breastfed, hasn't been able to drink, misses her mom's milk. You know, you have to wean the baby off.
And the state had to beg ICE to return some of these women for separated from the children for what you say is not a crime.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right.
You know, the interesting thing about this is, well, we read about it in New Bedford, and we go, oh dear, that was so terrible, so horrible, and then we don't hear anything more about it, and we assume it stopped. But what we're not aware of is that, no, now they're raiding in Minnesota, now they're raiding in California, now they're raiding in Ohio, and keeping anybody from putting it all together, that this is going on constantly. Right?
They're very proud of this. So there's quite a lot of statistics on their website of raids and arrests. So on the ICE website. Also, there's an organization in Washington, D.C. called Detention Watch that tries to collect data on this, but it is hard to, because a lot of it is covert, especially since Obama took place. It's even harder because the large workplace raids that were very visible, that put a lot of pressure on ICE, have gone, and it's more this one-on-one family by family, and it's a lot harder to monitor because it's not always in the paper.
And I'll tell you, if you break into one or two families on one evening, it spreads, right? So people hear about it, and they're aware that police are coming into the house and seizing people, right? And a lot of times they arrest the citizens as well and then let them go, but after they've spent some time in jail.
And we have actually deported. Most recently, we deported someone who he was handicapped. He had Down syndrome. He was a U.S. citizen, but he couldn't really explain himself, and so he was deported. And that's not new. Historically, in the 1920s and 30s, to break unions in California in the farms, the government would drive up with buses, put everybody on, and drive them down to the south of the border. But, there's a lot of Mexicans in California who've been there for, 200-300 years. They were Americans. So we deported Americans many times before. But the thing about the raids also is, since 2006, there's been a 400% increase in raids. And so one of the things that academics are trying to figure out is what happened all of a sudden in the end of 2006. And immigrant activists, so a lot of the Irish Immigration Center, Centro Presente, there's lots of local organizations that point to the fact that we had in March, April, and May of 2006, we had immigrant protests. I don't know if you remember. Millions of immigrants came out.
Wouldn't go to work.
Yes, because, and here highlights the fact that this is not a crime. The Sessenbrenner bill would have made being undocumented a crime. It would have made it a felony, and it didn't pass. So once again, I want to repeat, it's not a crime to be undocumented. So anyway, millions of people came out, and then unprecedented. No time in history had immigrants ever protested, and since then, 1, 2, 3 months later, there's a 400% increase in raids and detentions and deportation in those raids like New Bedford. And so what they're arguing, what immigrant activists and immigrant organizations are saying, this is state repression. This is to terrorize us and to say, how dare you? Who do you think you are coming out and protesting? You don't even belong here, although many of them were citizens. But so these raids are a way to terrorize people and put fear into them so that they are exploitable workers, that we can take advantage of them and pay them less than minimum wage, and that they're not going to speak up.
How come we have so many Mexicans here? This hasn't always been the case. It's sudden, all this enormous rise. What's the reason?
The reason is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and other similar free trade policies. Prior to NAFTA, we had very, very few undocumented immigrants. Certainly none around here. You never saw Brazilians on the Cape or in Marblehead. Prior to 1994, Latinos would come, harvest our crops, so we benefited from their labor. The salads we made were from their labor, and then they would go back. So it was a circular migration. There's lots of literature on it. In 1994, NAFTA passed. We built factories on the border, which then attracted all sorts of people from the interior of Mexico that were displaced to the border, but then, of course, there was too many. And those who did have jobs, so those people who didn't have jobs thought, oh, well, we'll just cross the border, we're already here. And those who did have jobs knew that if they went 5 miles north, they could make $5 a day, an hour, instead of $5 a day. And so they went up. And then, unlike before, where they could just come back to visit their families, we built a wall. And so once you're up, it's too dangerous to cross twice. Right. And so the Southwest got saturated, and then people started moving out of the Southwest because there was not enough jobs to the Midwest and all the way to the Cape.
And the other thing is that NAFTA, the maquiladores there didn't pay enough. I saw a movie in which 3 members of a family were working, and they were living in a pathetic hut without electricity and water all around. They had to walk on planks through the mud. And so it was our foreign trade policies that forced all these Mexicans out of Mexico. And all we would have to do is pay them a living decent wage and move our work there so that more people. they want to stay home.
Yeah, and it's
if
not
they
just
could.
yeah, it's not just with Mexico. There's a great scholar at Columbia University, Saskia Sassen, and she's written a number of studies on the correlation between migration and investment flows. So places, the migration comes, economic migration comes from the places where we have invested the most economically, where we've invested monetarily and in production, in the building of factories. And so
And
it's like we build bridges and exploiting. So we build
people.
bridges.
Now, you are on the Governor's Council. What's it called? The New Americans Agenda?
The New Americans Agenda,
And what is Deval Patrick trying to accomplish with this?
Well, he signed an executive order in July of 2008 to try to develop, charging us to develop a set of policy recommendations on how to integrate immigrants into U.S. society more effectively.
So it's the opposite of Arizona, where they're trying to get them out. You're trying to figure out how to include them so that they're productive members of society.
Exactly. And they are very productive. I mean, for example, many people, especially the undocumented, people think that the undocumented don't pay taxes. Let me just take for one example, since we don't have a lot of time, but this is true of many other areas. Let's just take Social Security. The Social Security Administration, as of 2007, had $480 billion in what they call a suspense file of money that the undocumented immigrants have paid into the system, and as you know, they're not eligible for Social Security.
Right.
So really, every year about 9 million, the undocumented pay $9 million.
And they're subsidizing my Social Security.
Yes, they are subsidizing your Social Security.
But I don't think there's anyone here who doesn't have, if you have someone taking care of your lawn, they're Guatemalans, or if you have someone working in your house, they're Brazilians. I mean, we all have, and if you go into a store, people are speaking, some of them don't, some of the saleswomen don't speak English. They're our workforce.
Yes, they're our workforce. This is really, it's about NAFTA, it's about money. It's about money in so many different ways. Let me just give you another example about profit. And it's about the prison industrial complex. So every night we have, on any given night, we have about 33,400 detainees. Now, once again, they're not criminals, they haven't committed a crime, but anyway, we have them in prison anyway.
Right, anyway.
Anyway, it costs us $141 per person per night to keep them in jail. So that comes out to about $1.7 million every night, close to $5 billion for the year. Now, I personally would rather spend my taxpayer money not keeping someone in prison who hasn't committed a crime, who's been separated from their child, and I'd rather give it to the police department, the fire department, our local schools. But these are private prisons. Someone is making a lot of money.
And it's one of the fastest growing industries in America.
It is.
Invest, if you want to invest in our prison system.
But it's only successful if we have people to put them in. And who are we going to put in them? We're going to put black and brown bodies, African Americans or the undocumented. And, I work at the Irish Immigration Center, and I asked the Irish consul, vice consul, about her work, and she said, well, I visit the Irish, undocumented Irish, which is one of the highest groups of undocumented in Boston. When the agency started 20 years ago, there were 30,000 undocumented Irish in Boston. Anyway, and I said, so she says, I go visit them in jail. I said, what's the average stay of an Irish undocumented person in our prison in Boston, in the jail, the Suffolk County Jail? And she said, about 4 to 6 weeks.
Before they're deported.
Before they're deported. The average stay of a Latino or African, of a Latin American or African immigrant is about 9 months. Now, they haven't committed a crime. Why don't you just deport them? Why do we have to, for 9 months, pay every night for them to be here? Why don't they just get deported? Because someone's making money by keeping them in jail.
This is a sad story. I'm glad you're on the case, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Work hard. See if we can, in Massachusetts, somehow do something to make foreigners more welcome, remembering that all of us were foreign-born people in a strange land at some point in our heritage. And thank you very much for your work. I'm really glad you came.
So it's very nice to meet you, and thank you.
Okay.
'Cause an idea, this time has come, cannot be stopped by anyone. Plant your seeds in fertile ground. There ain't nothing gonna keep it down. Oh, we can do it. Yes, we can. We can change things throughout the land.